The chains originally intended for cattle were destined to serve a different, more terrible purpose. On that October night in 1851, Noah Carter's calloused hands closed around the cold iron links, while his master, Jonathan Pierce, hung inverted from the barn rafters, swaying grotesquely like butchered meat in the pale Georgia moonlight. The quiet field hand had finally reached his breaking point. Yet the question that would haunt the plantation for years to come was not how he had accomplished it, but why Pierce had never anticipated such betrayal from the man he had trusted most implicitly. Before we proceed further with this dark tale, please hit the subscribe button to make my day. And do let me know in the comments where you are watching from. The Pierce plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Georgia soil, its cotton fields extending like white waves under the autumn sun. Jonathan Pierce strode across these lands with the unshakable confidence of a man convinced that God had ordained his dominion over everything within his view, from the rustling cotton stalks to the bent backs laboring beneath them. At 34 years of age, he had inherited far more than mere land from his father. He had inherited an unshakable faith in the natural order, a core belief that some men were born to command, while others were destined for servitude. Noah Carter moved through those same fields with a different kind of certainty, the quiet assurance of a man who knew every single inch of soil he had worked for 23 long years. His hands, scarred by countless seasons of planting and harvesting, could read the earth like Holy Scripture. He knew precisely when the cotton was ready by the specific sound it made in the wind, and which patches would yield the best harvest by the subtle color of the leaves at dawn. What Jonathan Pierce viewed as his rightful property, Noah understood as his personal prison, yet a prison he had learned to navigate with the careful precision of a man whose very survival depended on accurately reading the moods and movements of his captors. The morning of October 15th began like any other, with the plantation bell clanging across the slave quarters at 4:30 a.m., summoning the enslaved workers to another day of backbreaking labor. Noah pulled on his worn cotton shirt and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, his breath forming small, ghostly clouds in the pre-dawn darkness surrounding him. Other shadowy figures emerged from their cabins, moving with the practiced, economical efficiency of people who had learned never to waste a single motion, to conserve every ounce of strength for the grueling day ahead. Sarah walked beside him as they made their way toward the fields, her presence a quiet comfort that had sustained him through countless mornings just like this one. She had been his wife for 7 years now, though their union existed only within their own hearts and the recognition of their community, never in the eyes of a law that deemed them property rather than people. Her belly was swollen with their second child, and Noah felt the familiar, wrenching mixture of joy and terror that came with bringing new life into their world of bondage. "The baby's been kicking all night long," Sarah whispered, her hand resting protectively on her stomach as they walked. "It feels like this one has your restless spirit." Noah managed to smile despite the heavy weight of the day awaiting them. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this one won't accept chains so easily. The words hung dangerously between them, heavy with unspoken implication. Sarah's eyes met his, and in that shared look passed 1,000 conversations they could never voice aloud. Dreams of freedom that existed only in the fragile space between heartbeats, in stolen moments when the crushing weight of their circumstances lifted just enough to let a sliver of hope breathe. Jonathan Pierce emerged from his grand white-pillared house as the workers gathered in the fields, his polished boots clicking authoritatively against the wooden steps of the wraparound porch. He carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of Southern aristocracy, his shoulders straight and his chin lifted as if perpetually posing for a formal portrait. His blonde hair was perfectly combed, despite the early hour, and his clothes bore the crisp, sharp lines of garments that had never known the grime of fieldwork. "Morning, Noah," Pierce called out, his voice carrying the casual, unquestioned authority of a man who had never doubted his right to command. "I need you to check the north field today. Heard some of the hands saying the cotton there isn't being picked clean." "Yes, sir, Master Pierce," Noah replied, the words tasting like bitter ash in his mouth. He had perfected this tone over the years, respectful, but not servile, acknowledging Pierce's authority without completely surrendering his own inner dignity. It was a delicate, perpetual balancing act, one that required constant vigilance and self-control. Pierce nodded his approval and moved on, stopping to speak with other workers, dispensing orders with the casual efficiency of a man managing livestock. Noah watched him go, studying the way Pierce moved through his world, noting the blind, unthinking confidence that came from never having to consider another person's perspective, never having to wonder if the very ground might suddenly shift beneath his feet. The sun climbed higher as the day wore on, beating down upon the cotton fields with relentless intensity. Noah moved through the rows with practiced, rhythmic efficiency, his hands flying as he filled sack after sack with the white gold that made Jonathan Pierce a wealthy man and kept Noah in chains. The work was pure muscle memory now, allowing his mind to wander to places his body could never go. He thought of his son Marcus, now 5 years old, already showing signs of the sharp intelligence that both thrilled and terrified Noah. The boy asked questions constantly, his bright, curious eyes absorbing everything around him with the hungry wonder of childhood. Just the previous week, Marcus had asked why some people lived in the big house while others lived in the small cabins, and Noah had struggled to find the right words to satisfy his son's curiosity without planting dangerously rebellious ideas in his young, impressionable mind. "Different folks got different jobs," Noah had said carefully, acutely aware that Sarah was listening from across their small, cramped cabin. "Some folks work the fields, some folks work in the house." "But why can't we work in the house sometimes?" Marcus had pressed, his 5-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the brutal injustice with the unflinching honesty of childhood. "And the house folks work in the field sometimes?" Noah had exchanged a long, pained look with Sarah, seeing his own tumultuous thoughts and fears reflected perfectly in her eyes. How does one explain to a child that the world is built upon a foundational lie? How does one teach them to navigate a system meticulously designed to break their spirit without inadvertently breaking that very spirit in the process? The memory was abruptly interrupted by the sound of raised, agitated voices coming from the direction of the plantation house. Noah straightened up, shading his eyes against the harsh afternoon sun as he tried to discern what was happening. A group of men on horseback had arrived, the dust from their arrival still settling in the main courtyard. Even from this distance, Noah could sense the palpable tension in their postures, the way they sat their horses like men bearing grave, unwelcome news. Jonathan Pierce emerged from the house, his usual confident stride quickened by a visible urgency. The men dismounted and gathered closely around him, their voices carrying across the fields as urgent, heated whispers. Noah couldn't make out the specific words, but he could fluently read the eloquent language of their bodies, the way they leaned in conspiratorially, the sharp, abrupt gestures that spoke volumes of crisis and conspiracy. One of the riders, a thin man with a scraggly beard, pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and handed it to Pierce. Noah watched, his breath catching, as his master's face underwent a dramatic transformation, the casual, born-to-rule authority melting away into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. Pierce crumpled the paper violently in his fist, and snarled something that made the other men nod in grim unison. The meeting broke up with startling swiftness, the riders mounting their horses and galloping away in another choking cloud of dust. Pierce stood utterly alone in the courtyard for a long, suspended moment, staring after them before slowly turning his gaze toward the fields where his workers continued their labor, completely unaware of the violent storm now brewing within their master's mind. That evening, as the sun dipped below the pine trees bordering the plantation, Noah made his way to the barn to tend to the livestock. It was a duty he had voluntarily taken on years ago, one that granted him a few precious moments of solitude at the close of each exhausting day. The barn was his personal sanctuary, a place where he could think and breathe without the constant oppressive weight of watching white eyes. The cattle lowed softly as he entered, their large heads turning toward him with the lazy interest of well-fed, contented animals. Noah moved among them with easy familiarity, checking their water supply, adding fresh hay to their feed troughs, performing the simple, grounding rituals of care that connected him to something purer and larger than the brutal, dehumanizing machinery of plantation life. It was here, in the tranquil golden light filtering through the barn's wooden slats, that Jonathan Pierce found him. Noah. Pierce's voice sliced through the peaceful sounds of the animals, sharp and laced with an edge Noah had never heard directed at him before. I need to speak with you. Noah straightened up slowly, his hand still resting on the warm flank of the nearest cow. Something in Pierce's tone set every one of his nerves on immediate edge, a predatory, hunting quality that made every primal instinct scream danger. Yes, sir, Master Pierce, he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. What can I do for you? Pierce stepped further into the shadowy barn, and Noah noticed for the first time that his master carried a coiled leather whip in his right hand, the braided leather gleaming dully in the fading evening light. The sight sent a shock of pure ice through Noah's veins, but he forced his face to remain an impassive mask, his body language deliberately calm and non-threatening. Had some visitors today, Pierce said, his tone deceptively conversational, but with an unmistakable undertone of cold steel. Men from the county seat. Seems there's been talk about runaway slaves, about people helping them get north. Underground railroad, they call it. Noah nodded carefully, his mind racing, unsure where this dangerous conversation was heading, but certain it led nowhere good. I've heard tell of such things, Master Pierce. Terrible business, slaves running off like that. Indeed it is, Pierce agreed, taking another deliberate step closer. What's particularly interesting is that these men seem to think someone on my plantation might be involved, someone who knows the local roads intimately, who has the trust of the other slaves, who might be in a position to help coordinate such activities. The naked accusation hung thick in the air between them like poisonous smoke, choking and suffocating. Noah felt his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he willed his voice to remain steady. Can't imagine who they might mean, Master Pierce. Most folks here are too busy with their own work to be thinking about such things. Pierce smiled then, a thin, cruel expression devoid of any warmth. Funny thing about trust, Noah. I've always thought you were one of the good ones. Reliable, hard-working, never caused me a moment's trouble. But now I'm wondering if I've been too trusting, too generous in my assessment of your character. The whip uncoiled slightly in Pierce's hand, the leather making a soft, sinister whisper against the leather of his boot. Noah's eyes tracked the movement instinctively, his body tensing involuntarily. He had seen that whip used before, had watched other men and women scream and bleed beneath its merciless bite. The memory of their agonized cries echoed in his mind, mixing horribly with the sound of his own blood roaring in his ears. Master Pierce, Noah said, choosing his words with extreme care. I've served your family faithfully for 23 years. My daddy worked these fields before me, and his daddy before him. This is the only home I've ever known." "And yet," Pierce said, taking another menacing step closer, "loyalty can be such a fragile, fickle thing. A man might serve faithfully for decades, all while secretly harboring resentments, nurturing secret plans. The question is, Noah, have you been harboring secrets?" The barn suddenly felt claustrophobically small, the walls seeming to press in around them. The cattle, sensing the sharp shift in tension, shifted restlessly in their stalls, their large, dark eyes wide and reflecting the dying light. Noah's mind raced, frantically considering his options, each one more terrible than the last. He could deny everything, hope against hope that Pierce had no real evidence. But the cold, certain look in his master's eyes suggested that denial would only postpone the inevitable punishment. He could try to run, to bolt for the door, before Pierce could stop him. But then what? Where could a black man possibly run in the heart of Georgia that white men wouldn't eventually hunt him down? "I don't know what you've heard, Master Pierce," Noah said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But I swear to you, I've never done anything to betray your trust." Pierce's smile widened, a predator's grin revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally white in the gathering darkness of the barn. "Oh, Noah, you still don't understand, do you? It doesn't matter what you've actually done. What matters is what people think you might have done. What matters is that I cannot afford to have any doubt at all, about the absolute loyalty of my property." The word property struck Noah like a physical blow, brutally stripping away years of careful pretense, of the fragile illusion that his decades of faithful service had earned him even a shred of genuine respect or humane consideration. In that searing, clarifying moment, he saw himself exactly as Pierce truly saw him, not as a man who had devoted his entire life to this land, but as a mere thing to be owned, controlled, and disposed of at his master's slightest whim. Pierce raised the whip, its leather tail unfurling, and in that terrible gesture, Noah saw his own death. Not just his physical death, though that was likely imminent, but the death of everything he had ever tried to build and protect, every fragile hope he had ever dared to nurture for himself and his family. Sarah's face flashed vividly through his mind, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. And then Marcus, with his bright, inquisitive eyes, asking questions about justice for which there were no good answers. The whip cracked through the air with a sickening sound, but Noah was already in motion. 23 years of relentless hard labor had forged him into a physically powerful man, and sheer desperation now lent him explosive speed. He lunged forward inside the arc of the descending whip, his shoulder driving hard into Pierce's chest and sending them both crashing back against the sturdy wooden wall of the barn. Pierce grunted loudly, surprise and sharp pain mingling in the guttural sound as they slammed into the feed bins. The whip fell from his suddenly limp hand as he struggled to regain his footing. But Noah was already upon him, his work-calloused hands closing like iron vices around Pierce's throat. 23 years, Noah whispered, his voice raw with decades of suppressed emotion. 23 years I've served you faithfully, and this is my reward. Baseless accusations and violent threats. Pierce clawed frantically at Noah's powerful hands, his face turning a deep, mottled red as he fought desperately for air. His eyes, wide with utter shock and dawning terror, locked with Noah's. And for the very first time in his privileged life, Jonathan Pierce saw a slave not as property or a tool, but as a man with his own deep desires, burning grievances, and a terrifying capacity for violence. "Please," Pierce gasped, the word barely audible, choked out from his constricted throat. "Noah, please." But Noah's hands only tightened their grip further, years of suppressed rage and humiliation coursing through his fingers like lightning. He thought of every single morning he had been forced to awaken before dawn to serve another man's wealth and ambition. Every evening he had collapsed into exhausted sleep, while Pierce dined on fine food and slept in a soft, warm bed. He thought of watching his own son grow up in chains, of knowing that no amount of parental love or protection could ever fully shield Marcus from the world's systemic, casual cruelty. Pierce's struggles grew progressively weaker, his face deepening in hue from a furious red to a worrying purple. His hands fell away from Noah's unyielding wrists, reaching out blindly for something, anything that might offer salvation. His flailing fingers found and closed around a heavy chain hanging from the barn's rafters, the same iron links used to hoist hay bales and occasionally to slaughter cattle for meat. The bitter irony of the moment was not lost on Noah as Pierce's hand desperately grasped the chain. Here was the very instrument of his own lifelong servitude, the stark symbol of everything that bound him to this place, this existence of endless back-breaking labor and daily degradation. And now it would serve a completely different, final purpose. Noah released his grip on Pierce's throat and swiftly grabbed the chain himself, wrapping it tightly around his master's wrists with the same practiced efficiency he had used countless times to bind cattle for slaughter. Pierce gasped and coughed violently, trying to draw precious air back into his lungs, but Noah worked with grim determination, securing the bonds with knots he had perfected over a lifetime of farm work. "What are you doing?" Pierce wheezed, his voice thin and freighted with genuine fear. "Noah, think about what you're doing. Think about your family." The mention of Sarah and Marcus sent a fresh, white-hot wave of rage coursing through Noah's entire system. "That's all I've been thinking about," he said coldly, testing the knots to ensure they would hold under strain. "Every single day for 23 years, that's all I've thought about. How to keep them safe. How to make sure they had enough food to eat. How to shield them from men exactly like you." He walked purposefully over to the pulley system that controlled the chain, the same mechanism he had operated countless times before to lift heavy loads of hay and grain. Pierce's eyes followed his every move, horrified understanding dawning in their pale blue depths as he finally realized Noah's terrible intention. "Noah, please," Pierce begged, all pretense of masterful authority now completely stripped away, revealing the frightened man beneath. "I have a family, too. I have children. They need their father." Noah's hand paused for a brief moment on the coarse pulley rope. Pierce's desperate words managed to penetrate the red haze of his all-consuming anger, reminding him starkly that the man now hanging before him was more than just a symbol of oppression. He was a human being with people who loved him, people who would genuinely mourn his death. But then Noah's mind filled with the memories of all the other families that had been torn apart by Pierce's casual cruelty and economic decisions. All the children who had been sold away from their weeping parents to pay off gambling debts or satisfy a sudden financial whim. He thought of the woman named Julia who had tried to escape to freedom last spring, and how Pierce had made a brutal public example of her, ordering her mercilessly whipped in front of the entire plantation population until her back was a ruined landscape of torn, bleeding flesh. "Your children will grow up free and privileged," Noah said quietly, his hand tightening once more on the rough rope. "They'll never know what it feels like to belong body and soul to another person, to have every aspect of their lives decided by someone else's arbitrary whim. My children have never had that luxury." He pulled hard on the rope, and Pierce rose jerkily into the air, his feet leaving the solid ground as the chain lifted him inexorably toward the barn's shadowy rafters. Pierce struggled weakly against his bonds, his face contorting with pure fear and sharp pain as the unyielding iron links cut cruelly into his wrists. "This is murder!" Pierce gasped, his voice tight and high with sheer panic. "This is cold-blooded murder, and they'll hunt you down and hang you for it." Noah continued pulling steadily until Pierce hung completely upside down from the rafters, swaying gently in the cool evening air like a side of beef in a butcher's shop. The inverted position would ensure that blood rushed relentlessly to Pierce's head, making his death slower, more agonizing and conscious. It was the same method they used to slaughter the plantation's cattle, a technique designed to drain the blood completely from the carcass for better meat. "Maybe they will hang me," Noah said, his voice flat and resigned, as he secured the rope with a series of practiced, unshakable knots. "But at least I'll die knowing that for once in my entire life, I chose my own actions. For once, I wasn't dancing helplessly to another man's tune." Pierce's face was already beginning to turn a deep, alarming red from the blood pooling in his head. His struggles grew noticeably weaker as the unnatural position rapidly sapped his strength, but his eyes remained fixed on Noah, with a terrifying mixture of pure hatred and desperate, silent pleading. "My family will hunt you down like a dog," Pierce whispered, his voice strained and faint. "They'll track you to the very ends of the earth. You'll never be safe again, not for a single moment." Noah walked slowly to the spot where Pierce had dropped the whip and picked it up, testing its familiar weight and balance in his hand. The leather felt different to him now, not the hated symbol of his oppression, but a potential tool of his long-awaited liberation. "Maybe so," he said, his voice steady. "But Sarah and Marcus will be far safer without me here than they would be with me once people start asking dangerous questions about what happened here tonight." He raised the whip high and brought it down with all his strength across Pierce's exposed back, the sharp crack echoing through the cavernous barn like a clap of thunder. Pierce screamed, a raw, primal sound of agony unlike anything Noah had ever heard emerge from his master's lips before. It was the unmistakable sound of a man discovering, too late, that he was not, after all, immune to the very same cruelties he had so casually inflicted upon others for years. "That's for Julia," Noah said, his voice cold and deliberate as he raised the whip once more. The second blow landed with brutal force across Pierce's chest, and this time the resulting scream was weaker, more choked and breathless. Bright red blood immediately began to seep through the fine fabric of Pierce's white shirt, spreading rapidly and staining the material a dark, ugly crimson. That's for every child ever sold away from their weeping mother's arms. The third powerful blow opened a deep, jagged gash across Pierce's stomach, and Pierce's screams dissolved into pathetic, gurgling whimpers. His struggles had ceased entirely now, his body hanging completely limp and heavy from the chain, kept conscious only by the blood rushing to his brain. "And this," Noah said, raising the whip one final decisive time, "this is for every single morning I was forced to wake up in chains." The final, merciful blow fell, and Pierce's weak whimpers ceased altogether. His body swayed gently, almost peacefully, from the rafters, blood dripping in a steady, rhythmic pattern onto the packed earth floor of the barn below. Noah watched in silence for several long minutes, waiting to feel some expected sense of satisfaction or cathartic release. But there was only a profound emptiness, a hollow, aching space where his burning rage had so recently resided. He dropped the bloody whip onto the floor and walked slowly to the barn's main door, looking out across the moonlit plantation grounds. Dim lights flickered in the windows of the slave quarters, where families were gathering for their simple evening meals, where children were being lovingly tucked into their rough beds, the ordinary, comforting rhythms of life, continuing unaware of the life-altering violence that had just occurred mere yards away in the barn. Noah thought of Sarah, probably already worrying about where he was, why he was so late returning from his evening duties. He thought of Marcus, perhaps already asking for a bedtime story, his bright, innocent eyes full of unconditional trust and love for his father. The crushing knowledge that he would never see either of them again, never hold them close, cut deeper into his soul than any whip ever could have scarred his flesh. But he knew, with cold certainty, that there was no other possible choice. By morning, Pierce's body would inevitably be discovered, and the manhunt would begin in earnest. Every enslaved person on the plantation would be subjected to brutal questioning, severe beatings, and possibly even summary execution in the frantic search for the murderer. Noah could not, would not, allow his beloved family to suffer for his actions, could not let them pay the ultimate price for his single, desperate moment of rebellion. He walked back to Pierce's lifeless body and began the grisly, necessary work of staging the scene. Using his own sharp knife, he made additional, deliberate cuts, deepening some wounds and creating new ones, trying his best to make the violence look like the work of multiple attackers. He scattered Pierce's personal belongings haphazardly around the barn, overturned feed buckets, broke tools deliberately, all to create the convincing appearance of a violent struggle involving several determined people. When he was finally satisfied with his grim handiwork, Noah cleaned himself as best he could, using straw and water from the animal trough, and slipped quietly out of the barn into the embracing darkness. The night was clear and bitterly cold. Countless stars were scattered brilliantly across the vast black sky like a handful of scattered diamonds. Somewhere up there, among those distant lights, his ancestors were surely watching, and Noah found himself wondering, with a strange detachment, what they must think of what he had been driven to do. He made his way cautiously toward the slave quarters, moving like a ghost between the silent cabins until he reached his own small, familiar home. Through the single grimy window, he could see Sarah moving about inside, her advanced pregnancy making her movements careful and deliberately slow. Marcus sat at their small, rough-hewn table, quietly playing with the carved wooden animals that Noah had lovingly made for him over the years. Noah pressed his face against the cold glass, memorizing every precious detail of the domestic scene, storing it away forever in the deepest, most protected chamber of his heart, where no one could ever take it from him. Sarah suddenly looked up, as if she had somehow sensed his presence outside, and their eyes met through the imperfect pane of glass. She smiled a tired, welcoming smile, and gestured gently for him to come inside. But Noah shook his head slowly, a movement filled with infinite sadness. He pressed his open palm flat against the cold glass in a silent farewell, and Sarah's expression shifted instantly, confusion giving way to dawning concern as she read something profound and final in his face that she didn't fully understand, but that filled her heart with immediate, chilling dread. She began moving quickly toward the window, but Noah was already turning away, melting back into the protective shadows from which he had emerged. He made his way silently to the very edge of the plantation, where the dense pine forest began its dark embrace. Here he stopped and looked back one last, long time at the only home he had ever known. The barn was a dark, ominous silhouette against the starry sky, Pierce's body hanging silently inside like some grotesque, nightmarish scarecrow. The slave quarters were mostly quiet and dark now, their weary inhabitants settled uneasily for the night, completely unaware that their world was about to be violently upended forever. Noah turned his back resolutely on the Pierce plantation and stepped into the waiting forest. Behind him, the physical and psychological chains that had bound him for 23 long years now lay broken and useless. But ahead lay only profound uncertainty, constant danger, and the fragile, slender hope of a freedom he had only ever dreamed of. His feet found an old, nearly invisible game trail that led north, toward a mythical land he had heard whispered about in songs and stories, but had never seen with his own eyes, a land where a man might someday walk truly upright and call himself by his own name without fear. The thick carpet of pine needles muffled his footsteps perfectly as he walked steadily through the deep night, guided by the constant, unwavering North Star that had called to countless other desperate souls before him on this same perilous journey. He thought of the legendary Underground Railroad, the secret network of incredibly brave souls who risked everything, their freedom, their lives, to help people exactly like him reach safety and liberty. Maybe he would be fortunate enough to find them. Maybe they would help him navigate the dangerous path to the promised land of the northern states and Canada. Or maybe he would die alone in these dark, unforgiving woods, hunted down like a runaway animal by Pierce's vengeful family and friends. Either way, he had finally chosen his own fate, had acted according to his own will and moral compass rather than another man's command. That hard-won knowledge gave him a core of inner strength as he walked deeper into the unknown forest, leaving behind absolutely everything he had ever known and loved in a desperate pursuit of something he had never truly dared to believe could be possible for him. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient, silent patterns as Noah walked relentlessly through the night. And with each determined step, he took away from his old life. The invisible chains that had bound his spirit for so long grew a little lighter, until finally they fell away entirely, leaving him truly free for the first time to walk his own chosen path under the vast, impartial Georgia sky. Dawn came slowly, almost reluctantly, to the Pierce plantation, painting the eastern horizon in soft, beautiful shades of pink and gold. The plantation bell rang out its usual call at 4:30 a.m., summoning the enslaved workers to yet another day of relentless labor. They emerged from their cramped cabins, just as they had on countless mornings before, completely unaware that this particular day would be unlike any other in the plantation's long, troubled history. It was young Jacob, sent on a simple morning errand, who made the grisly discovery. He had been dispatched to the barn to feed the cattle, a routine task that should have taken only a few uneventful minutes. His scream of pure, unadulterated horror echoed across the quiet plantation grounds, a sound so visceral and shock-filled that it brought people running from all directions. By the time a crowd had gathered, Jacob was on his knees in the red Georgia clay outside the barn, vomiting violently from the shock of what he had witnessed. He could only point a trembling, accusatory finger toward the barn's dark doorway, utterly unable to form coherent words to describe the nightmare scene he had stumbled upon inside. The plantation's head overseer, a notoriously hard man named Briggs, pushed his way authoritatively through the growing crowd and stepped cautiously into the barn's shadowy interior. His own sharp, shocked exclamation upon seeing what lay within confirmed what Jacob's hysterical reaction had already suggested, that something truly unspeakable and terrible had transpired in the night. "Get everyone back!" Briggs shouted as he emerged from the barn, his face pale and drawn with horror. "Nobody else goes in there until the sheriff arrives from town." But human curiosity and morbid fascination are powerful, primal forces, and despite Briggs's stern orders, frantic whispers began to spread like wildfire through the assembled crowd. Those few who had managed to catch a fleeting glimpse inside the barn before being forcibly pushed back spoke in hushed, terrified tones of blood pooling on the earthen floor, of chains hanging ominously from the rafters, of their master's body displayed in a manner more befitting butchered livestock than a human being. Sarah stood silently at the edge of the anxious crowd, her hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, her eyes desperately searching for any sign of Noah among the frightened faces surrounding her. She had awakened in the cold, pre-dawn darkness to find his side of their shared bed empty and long cold. And a sick, sinking feeling had been steadily growing in the pit of her stomach ever since that discovery. Now, witnessing the undisguised horror on the faces of those who had glimpsed inside the barn, that vague feeling crystallized into a terrible, unshakable certainty. The county sheriff arrived within 2 hours, a heavy-set man named Williamson, who rode up in a hurried cloud of dust with 3 grim-faced deputies trailing closely behind him. They spent what felt like an eternity inside the shadowy barn, meticulously examining the gruesome scene, conversing in hushed, serious voices. When they finally emerged into the daylight, Williamson's face was set in grim lines, heavy with the full knowledge of what this brutal death meant for every single person living on the plantation. "I want every enslaved person accounted for immediately," he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice booming with authority. "Every man, woman, and child. Nobody leaves these grounds until we figure out exactly what happened here." The next several hours descended into a nightmare of intense questioning and wild accusations. The enslaved workers were lined up systematically and interrogated one by one. Their living quarters were roughly searched, their meager possessions examined for any scrap of evidence that might connect them to Pierce's murder. Some were beaten severely when their answers failed to satisfy the impatient investigators. Others were struck for appearing either too nervous or suspiciously calm under pressure. Sarah endured her own questioning with the stoic, impenetrable dignity of a woman who had learned to survive by revealing absolutely nothing of her true inner thoughts and feelings. When Sheriff Williamson pointedly asked about Noah's current whereabouts, she looked him directly in the eye and stated calmly that she assumed he was already working in the fields, as he did every single day. "When did you last see your husband?" Williamson pressed harder, his small, pig-like eyes studying her face intently for any flicker of deception. "Last night at supper," Sarah replied truthfully, for this was technically accurate. She had indeed seen Noah through their cabin's small window, had watched him turn away and disappear silently into the gathering shadows. But she had not spoken a single word to him, had not been told where he was going or why he was leaving. Young Marcus was also subjected to questioning, despite his tender age. The frightened child sat on his mother's protective lap, his normally bright eyes wide with confusion and fear as strange grown men fired questions at him that he couldn't possibly understand about his father's activities. When Marcus innocently asked why Papa wasn't there to answer the questions himself, Sarah simply held him tighter against her body and whispered that Papa had to work in a different field, far away today. By the afternoon, it had become painfully clear to everyone that Noah Carter had vanished from the plantation without a single trace. His work tools were still neatly stored in their assigned places. His few personal possessions remained undisturbed in their cabin, but the man himself had disappeared as completely and utterly as if the red Georgia earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The tracking dogs specially brought in from the county seat initially picked up his scent, leading directly toward the dense pine forest, but then lost it frustratingly at a shallow, rocky creek that ran through the woods. The organized search continued relentlessly for days, expanding outward from the plantation in ever-widening, desperate circles. Patrols of armed white men combed the surrounding countryside, searching every barn, shed, and remote cabin, questioning anyone who might have possibly seen a runaway slave matching Noah's description. Substantial monetary rewards were posted in neighboring counties, publicly describing Noah Carter as a dangerous, cold-blooded murderer who should be shot on sight for the safety of the community. But Noah had effectively vanished into the vast, secret network of people and safe houses that comprised the Underground Railroad, that shadowy, loosely organized movement dedicated to helping enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. Whether he actually reached the safety of the northern states or died anonymously in the attempt, whether he lived to a peaceful old age under an assumed new name, or was captured and brutally killed somewhere along the treacherous journey, became one of the great, enduring mysteries that the plantation's remaining inhabitants would discuss in hushed, speculative whispers for many sorrowful years to come. Sarah gave birth to her daughter 3 months later during a severe cold snap in January that froze the water solid in the wash basins and made the thin cabin walls creak and groan with frost. She named the tiny baby Hope, a choice that raised skeptical eyebrows among both the enslaved community and the plantation's new owner, Pierce's bitter brother, who had abruptly inherited the troubled property. Marcus grew up with the complex story of his father's dramatic disappearance woven deeply into the very fabric of his childhood. It was a tale that changed subtly with each retelling, adapted to the listener and the circumstance, but it always ended with the same powerful image of Noah walking resolutely away into the darkness, consciously choosing uncertain freedom over relative safety, defiant rebellion over quiet submission. To the impressionable boy, his absent father gradually became a figure of near legend, a man who had heroically refused to accept the chains that everyone else around him simply took for granted as an unchangeable fact of life. The new master, Robert Pierce, ruled the plantation with an iron fist from the very beginning, grimly determined not to repeat his brother's fatal mistake of trusting his human property too much or treating them with any semblance of kindness. The workdays grew longer and more demanding. The punishments became increasingly harsher and more arbitrary. The general atmosphere more tense and oppressive than anyone could remember. But sometimes, when the work was particularly backbreaking, or the overseer's whip fell with unusual sadistic cruelty, the enslaved workers would whisper furtively among themselves about Noah Carter, the quiet, unassuming field hand who had finally found the courage to say a simple, powerful no. Years turned into decades, and the story naturally took on the mythic, larger-than-life qualities that such powerful tales inevitably acquire with the passage of time and countless retellings. Some claimed Noah had successfully made it all the way to Canada, where he worked proudly as a free man and somehow managed to send secret, coded messages back to his grieving family. Others insisted he had joined the burgeoning Union Army when the Civil War finally erupted, fighting courageously to liberate those he had been forced to leave behind in bondage. Still others whispered that he had never actually left Georgia at all, but lived out his days as a cunning fugitive, deep in the trackless woods, secretly helping other runaway slaves find their perilous way to freedom. The literal truth, like Noah himself, had disappeared completely into the impenetrable shadows of history, leaving behind only the enduring, powerful story of one man's ultimate refusal to accept the fundamentally unacceptable. One transformative moment when the oppressed violently became the oppressor, when human property decisively claimed ownership of his own fate and destiny. In the barn where Jonathan Pierce had died his terrible death, the dark blood stains on the floor eventually faded with time and weather, and the ominous chains were eventually taken down and replaced. But the enslaved workers who tended the cattle there would sometimes pause thoughtfully in their daily work, listening to the wind whispering through the rafters and remembering with chilling clarity the fateful night when everything had changed forever on the plantation. They would think of Noah Carter walking steadily northward under the cold, guiding stars, and wonder if somewhere out there in the vast, unknown world, beyond the plantation's visible boundaries, a truly free man was quietly telling his own children about the home he had been forced to leave behind, and the heavy, permanent price he had willingly paid for his hard-won liberty. The Pierce plantation continued its grim operations until 1865, when advancing Union troops finally arrived to formally inform its inhabitants that slavery had been legally abolished by law, and they were all free at last to go wherever they pleased in the world. Sarah, now a woman in her resilient 40s, immediately gathered her children and few possessions and prepared to leave the only home she had ever known. As they walked together down the dusty main road that led away from the plantation's oppressive fields for the final time, Marcus, now a grown man, looked back over his shoulder one last time at the weathered barn, where his father had made his legendary, desperate stand. "Do you think Papa ever actually made it north to freedom?" he asked his mother, his voice quiet and heavy with the accumulated weight of a lifetime of wondering. Sarah smiled a soft, knowing smile and took her son's work-roughened hand in her own, her daughter walking steadfastly beside them with her own young children in tow, the next generation born blessedly into a world where the brutal chains of slavery were finally, irrevocably broken. "I think your papa found exactly what he was looking for all along," she said, her wise eyes fixed firmly on the long road stretching out ahead of them. "He found a way to be free, in his heart and in his soul." The story of Noah Carter gradually became an integral part of the rich oral tradition that formerly enslaved families carefully passed down through the generations, a potent reminder that even in the very darkest of times, fundamental human dignity could never be completely extinguished or destroyed. It was a story fundamentally about the steep, often bloody price of freedom, about the precise moment when mere endurance transforms into active resistance, when a single man decides conclusively that death with dignity is infinitely preferable to a long life without it. In the difficult years that followed the war, as the shattered country struggled to rebuild itself after the Civil War's devastation, Noah's story was told and retold in countless black churches and fledgling schools, in intimate family gatherings and larger community meetings. Each telling inevitably added new descriptive details, new philosophical interpretations, new layers of meaning, until the quiet, seemingly ordinary field hand who had disappeared into the Georgia woods became a powerful symbol of something far larger than any one individual. To some, he was a clear hero who had struck a necessary blow for justice in a profoundly unjust world. To others, he was a cautionary tale about the inherent dangers of pushing oppressed people too far beyond their limits. To his own family, he remained simply a loving husband and devoted father who had loved them enough to sacrifice everything he had for the mere possibility of a better, freer world for them all. The barn on the Pierce plantation stood for many years after the war's end, slowly weathering countless storms and changing seasons until finally the roof collapsed inwards and the weakened walls fell in on themselves, returning to the earth. But the story itself lived on vibrantly, passed faithfully from parent to child, from teacher to student, from preacher to congregation, a living testament to the enduring power of one determined person to change their world, even if that profound change comes at the ultimate, terrible cost. In the end, Noah Carter's true legacy was not the violence he had felt compelled to do, but the personal freedom he had courageously claimed for himself. Not the life he had been forced to take, but the life he had chosen to live henceforth on his own terms and by his own moral code. He had walked voluntarily into the darkness of the Georgia woods and emerged from it as something new and unbreakable, something that could never again be owned or controlled or contained within the narrow, confining boundaries of another man's definition or desire. Whether he physically lived to see the formal end of slavery, whether he died a documented free man or an anonymous fugitive, whether his bones rested in some forgotten, unmarked grave or in the hallowed soil of a northern cemetery, mattered far less than the simple, powerful fact that he had chosen his own fate, had written his own ending to a life story that others had tried to dictate for him since birth. The chains that had bound him to the Pierce plantation had been made of far more than mere iron and steel. They had been painstakingly forged from unjust laws and deeply ingrained customs, from the accumulated weight of centuries of systemic injustice, from the pervasive belief that some people were simply born to serve, while others were born to command. But on that one decisive October night in 1851, Noah Carter had broken those chains with his own two hands, had proven conclusively that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, is ultimately stronger than the human spirit's innate, unquenchable desire for freedom and self-determination. His story became an enduring reminder that history is not made only by the famous and the powerful, but also, and perhaps more importantly, by ordinary people who find themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances and choose to act with immense courage rather than bow silently with passive resignation. It was a story about the precise moment when the impossible suddenly becomes inevitable, when lasting change comes not through patient, gradual reform, but through sudden, irreversible, decisive action. The pine forests of Georgia still whisper mysteriously with the passing wind, and sometimes, on certain clear nights, when the stars are particularly bright and the air is crisp and clean, it is almost possible to imagine a lone, determined figure walking steadily through those dark woods, heading unerringly north toward a freedom that exists not just as a physical place, but as a state of mind, a permanent condition of the soul. Noah Carter had found that elusive freedom in the most unlikely of places, in the single, transformative moment when he chose to fight back rather than continue submitting, to act decisively rather than merely endure silently. His story lived on powerfully through the decades because it spoke directly to something universal and fundamental in the shared human experience: the deep, abiding desire to control one's own destiny, to live a life according to one's own deeply held values and beliefs, rather than constantly striving to meet someone else's expectations and demands. It was a story about the heavy price of dignity and the steep cost of true justice, about what inevitably happens when ordinary people are pushed systematically beyond the natural limits of human endurance. In black churches across the Reconstruction South, progressive preachers would often tell the story of Noah Carter as a stirring example of how the meek could indeed inherit the earth, how the last could miraculously become first, how even the most seemingly powerless individuals could find a way to assert their basic humanity against overwhelming odds. In newly established schools for freedmen, dedicated teachers would use his dramatic tale to illustrate the complex, difficult moral questions that arose naturally from the institution of slavery itself, the way that an inherently unjust system could corrupt and degrade both the oppressor and the oppressed alike, creating tragic situations where violence sometimes became the only language of protest that could be widely heard and understood. The story itself evolved organically with each succeeding generation, naturally taking on new shades of meaning and relevance as the country itself changed, and struggled with its own legacy. During the passionate civil rights movement of the 1960s, Noah Carter's name was sometimes invoked by determined activists who saw in his desperate actions a powerful historical precedent for active resistance against ongoing racial oppression. His demonstrated willingness to risk everything he had for the cause of freedom resonated deeply with people who were facing their own contemporary struggles for basic dignity and equality. People who understood through bitter experience that sometimes meaningful social progress requires far more than just endless patience and quiet prayer. But the story also carried sobering warnings about the profound, lasting cost of violence, even when undertaken for a just cause. The way that taking another human life, even in desperate self-defense, or for the cause of liberation, leaves permanent, invisible scars on the human soul that never fully heal. Those who told Noah's story with care were always careful to emphasize that his violent actions arose from a place of utter desperation rather than cold calculation, that he was fundamentally a good man pushed far beyond his breaking point, rather than a cold-blooded killer who set out from the beginning to murder his master in cold blood. The inherent complexity of Noah's character, the way he could be viewed simultaneously as both victim and perpetrator, both folk hero and cautionary tale, gave his story a moral and psychological depth that simpler, one-dimensional morality tales often sorely lack. He was not portrayed as a perfect man or a blameless saint, but rather as a complex, fully human being, struggling desperately to maintain his core humanity within an overwhelmingly inhumane system, trying his best to protect his vulnerable family while somehow preserving his own inner dignity and self-respect. As the decades slowly passed and the immediate, raw pain of slavery began to fade gradually into broader historical memory, Noah Carter's story naturally took on an almost mythical, archetypal quality. He became a symbolic figure, like the legendary John Henry or Paul Bunyan, larger than life in the collective imagination, yet still firmly rooted in the real, painful experiences of real, suffering people. Children would hear his story and dream of their own moments of defiance, their own chances to stand up against injustice and claim their freedom. The barn on the Pierce plantation became a pilgrimage site for some, a place where people would come to remember not just Noah Carter, but all the enslaved people who had suffered and died in bondage. They would stand in the ruins and imagine that October night in 1851 when the natural order of things had been turned upside down, when the slave had become the master of his own fate. Historians would debate the details of Noah's story, questioning which parts were fact and which were legend. But the power of the tale lay not in its historical accuracy, but in its emotional truth. It captured something essential about the American experience, the tension between the ideals of freedom and equality and the reality of oppression and injustice. The story also became a reminder that freedom is not a gift that can be given or taken away by others, but a condition that must be claimed and defended by each individual. Noah Carter had not waited for someone else to grant him liberty. He had seized it with his own hands, accepting the terrible consequences that came with that choice. In the final analysis, Noah Carter's legacy was not the violence he had committed, but the courage he had shown, not the life he had taken, but the life he had chosen to live. He had proven that even in the most desperate circumstances, human beings retain the capacity to choose their own path, to write their own story, to claim their own freedom, regardless of the cost. The wind still blows through the pine forests of Georgia, carrying with it the whispered stories of those who walked those paths before us. Somewhere in that wind, perhaps, is the spirit of Noah Carter, still walking north toward a freedom that exists not just as a destination, but as a way of being a refusal to accept the limitations that others would place upon the human spirit. His story reminds us that history is not just about the great movements and famous leaders, but about the individual moments when ordinary people choose to act with extraordinary courage. It is about the field hand who decides he will no longer bow his head, the mother who teaches her children to dream of freedom, the father who sacrifices everything so that his children might live in a better world. Noah Carter walked into the darkness of that October night and emerged as something new, something that couldn't be contained within the narrow definitions of his time. He became a symbol of the unquenchable human desire for freedom, a reminder that no system of oppression can completely destroy the human spirit. The chains that bound him were made of iron, but they were also made of law and custom, of the accumulated weight of centuries of injustice. When he broke those chains, he did more than free himself. He cracked the foundation of the entire system, proving that what seemed permanent and unchangeable was actually fragile and temporary. His story lives on because it speaks to something universal in the human experience, the desire to control one's own destiny, to live according to one's own values rather than someone else's expectations. It is a story about the moment when endurance becomes resistance, when survival becomes defiance, when a man decides that he would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. In the end, Noah Carter's greatest victory was not the death of Jonathan Pierce, but the birth of his own freedom. He had walked away from the plantation not just as a fugitive, but as a free man, carrying with him the knowledge that he had chosen his own fate, written his own story, claimed his own place in the world. The stars that guided him north on that long-ago night still shine in the Georgia sky, still calling to those who dream of freedom and are willing to pay its price. They are a reminder that liberty is not a destination, but a journey, not a gift, but a choice, not an ending, but a beginning. Noah Carter's story began in the cotton fields of Georgia, but it has no ending, because the struggle for human dignity and freedom continues in every generation, in every place, where people refuse to accept that things must remain as they have always been. His legacy is the knowledge that change is possible, that justice can triumph, that even the most powerless can find a way to claim their freedom. The plantation bell that once summoned enslaved workers to their labor is silent now. But the story of Noah Carter rings on a testament to the power of one person to change the world, to the courage required to break the chains of injustice, and to the eternal human hunger for freedom that no force on earth can ultimately suppress. He was a field hand who became a legend, a slave who claimed his liberty, a man who proved that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be contained within the narrow boundaries of another's definition. His story is America's story, a tale of struggle and sacrifice, of courage and consequence, of the long journey from bondage to freedom that defines our national character. In the ruins of the old barn, where the bloodstains have long since faded and the chains have rusted away, visitors sometimes claim they can still feel Noah's presence, still sense the power of that moment when everything changed. They stand in the silence and remember that freedom is not free, that justice comes at a cost, that the price of liberty is often paid in blood and sacrifice. Noah Carter's story reminds us that we are all capable of heroism, all capable of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. It calls us to examine our own lives, our own circumstances, our own willingness to fight for what we believe in, to sacrifice for what we love, to claim our own freedom regardless of the cost. The wind carries his story across the years, across the miles, across the boundaries that divide us, whispering to each new generation that freedom is possible, that justice can prevail, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find the courage to act according to their deepest convictions. Noah Carter walked into history on that October night in 1851, but he walked out of it as something more than a man, something more than a slave, something more than a victim. He became a symbol of the unconquerable human spirit, a reminder that no chain is stronger than the will to be free, no system more powerful than the individual courage to say no to injustice. His story ends where all the best stories end, not with answers, but with inspiration, not with conclusions, but with possibilities, not with an ending, but with the promise of new beginnings. Somewhere in the darkness of the Georgia woods, Noah Carter is still walking north, still moving toward a freedom that exists, not just as a place, but as a condition of the soul, still proving that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be contained. The story of Noah Carter, the quiet field hand who hung his master from the barn rafters like a slaughtered hog, became more than history. It became hope, more than memory. It became inspiration, more than a tale of one man's courage. It became a promise that freedom is possible for all who have the courage to claim it. Better to spend a single night in the wilderness than the rest of one's life in chains, or face an even worse fate. Noah nodded in solemn agreement, understanding completely that his survival now depended not just on the kindness of strangers, but critically on his own hard-won ability to accurately read people and assess dangerous situations, to sense impending danger before it fully revealed itself and became inescapable. The very skills he had been forced to develop as a slave, the constant vigilance, the ability to anticipate a master's shifting mood or an overseer's volatile temper, would now serve him well on his perilous journey north toward freedom. Before leaving Ben's safe cabin for the next leg of his journey, Noah carefully wrote a heartfelt letter to Sarah, pouring all his love and regret onto paper in the careful, self-taught script he had secretly mastered over long years of nighttime practice. He told her of his undying love for her and for Marcus, about his most cherished dreams for their unborn daughter, about his fervent hope that someday, against all odds, they might be miraculously reunited in a state of freedom. Ben promised solemnly to find some secure way to get the precious letter to her, though he warned honestly that it might take many months or even several years to safely accomplish, given the dangers and difficulties of communication. The second major stage of Noah's long journey took him through the rugged mountains of northern Georgia, where the Underground Railroad operated through a secret network of isolated caves and hidden trails known only to a handful of trusted guides. His conductor for this dangerous mountain stretch was a free black man named Joshua, who had made the harrowing journey to freedom himself several years earlier, and now risked his own liberty by returning regularly to help guide others along the same perilous path. Joshua was younger than Noah, perhaps only 25, but he moved through the challenging mountain terrain with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew intimately every rock outcrop and hidden ravine. He spoke very little during their 3 days of travel together, communicating mostly through subtle hand gestures and brief, whispered warnings about specific dangers that lay ahead on the trail. "Slave catcher's been through this area recently," Joshua explained quietly, as they sheltered together in a damp cave during a sudden rainstorm. "Found one of our safe houses just last week. Arrested the entire family that was hiding runaways. We got to be extra careful now, more than ever." The grim news sent a fresh chill straight through Noah's heart, a stark reminder that the Underground Railroad was not some infallible system, and that the brave people who risked their lives to help fugitive slaves were constantly vulnerable to betrayal, simple bad luck, and the relentless, profit-driven pursuit of those who benefited financially from human bondage. every single person who now helped him along his way was taking an enormous personal risk, potentially sacrificing their own hard-won freedom or even their very lives for the sake of his. "Why do you do it?" Noah asked, echoing the same fundamental question he had previously posed to Ben. "You made it out. You're free now. Why come back into this danger?" Joshua was quiet for a long, thoughtful time, staring out at the rain sheeting across the mountain valley below their cave. "Got a sister still in chains down in Alabama," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "Maybe she'll never make it out. Maybe she's too scared to even try. But maybe someday she will find the courage. And when that day comes, I want to make sure there's still a road for her to travel, people to help her along." The simple, powerful honesty of the answer struck Noah deeply. Joshua wasn't helping strangers out of abstract political principles or mere religious duty, but out of pure, personal love for someone he had been forced to leave behind, someone who might never directly benefit from his dangerous sacrifice, but whose potential future freedom gave profound meaning and purpose to his risky work. Noah thought immediately of Marcus and the daughter he would likely never see grow up. He wondered if someday they might attempt to follow this same path he was now traveling, might benefit from this same fragile network of brave souls who risked everything to help others claim their basic human right to freedom. The thought alone gave him renewed strength to continue forward, when physical exhaustion and deep despair threatened to completely overwhelm his spirit. The mountain crossing itself proved treacherous and exhausting, with narrow, crumbling paths that skirted terrifyingly deep ravines and hidden natural dangers that could easily trap the unwary or inexperienced traveler. But the landscape was also stunningly beautiful in a way that literally took Noah's breath away. Having spent his entire previous life confined to the flat, monotonous cotton country of central Georgia, he had never seen real mountains before, never experienced the awe-inspiring way they seemed to touch the very sky itself, or the profound sense of vast, open space that unfolded majestically from their wind-swept peaks. On their second night camping in another hidden mountain cave, Joshua shared sparse stories of other fugitives he had personally guided to freedom. There was Rachel, a house slave who had finally escaped, only after being forced to watch her young daughter sold away to a distant plantation in Mississippi. There was Daniel, a skilled blacksmith, who had used his specialized knowledge to forge freedom papers for other runaways before finally making his own desperate escape. There was Mary, barely 16 years old, who had run away after her master decided she was old enough for his unwanted personal attentions. Each story was unique in its details, but they all shared common, heartbreaking elements. That precise moment when human endurance became utterly unbearable, when the risk of a painful death seemed genuinely preferable to enduring another day in bondage, when a fragile spark of hope finally overcame paralyzing fear and raw desperation transformed slowly into steely determination. Noah began to understand, truly understand, that he was now part of something far larger than just his own personal quest for freedom. He was part of a growing, moral movement that challenged the very foundations of Southern society and its brutal economy. "How many actually make it all the way?" Noah asked, as they prepared to sleep in the cold mountain air. Joshua's face was grim in the flickering firelight. "Maybe half, if we're being honest," he said without sugarcoating. "Some get caught by patrols, some lose heart and turn back, some just disappear into the wilderness, and we never find out what finally happened to them. But the ones who do make it, they make their freedom count. They build new lives up north, raise freeborn children, show the world through their living that we're far more than what the slaveholders claim we are." The third arduous day brought them safely to the Tennessee border, where Noah was handed off carefully to another conductor in the network, a white woman named Elizabeth, who operated a critical way station cleverly disguised as a respectable boarding house catering to traveling merchants. Elizabeth was middle-aged and matronly in appearance, with steel-gray hair pulled tightly back and kind, observant eyes that missed absolutely nothing in her surroundings. "You'll be William Johnson, the free-colored man from South Carolina," she reminded him firmly, as they walked toward her establishment. "You're traveling to Cincinnati to take work in a furniture factory owned by your cousin. If anyone asks you detailed questions, remember you've never actually been to Cincinnati before, so you don't know much about the city, except what your cousin has told you in his letters." The boarding house itself was a complete revelation to Noah, who had never stayed in such a civilized place, or even properly imagined what such comfort would be like. There were real beds with clean, pressed sheets, hot meals served on actual china plates, and other travelers who treated him with the same distant, formal politeness they accorded to any other paying customer. For the very first time since fleeing the plantation, Noah experienced directly what it felt like to be seen and treated as a person, rather than as another man's legal property. But he knew this comforting illusion was fragile, entirely dependent on the quality of his forged papers and his own ability to play the assigned role convincingly under pressure. At the communal dinner that evening, he found himself seated next to a talkative cotton merchant from Alabama who spoke casually and openly about current prices being paid for prime field hands and the various difficulties of managing large numbers of enslaved workers efficiently. Of course, the real secret is keeping them properly scared, but not completely desperate, the merchant explained confidently, cutting into his roast beef with obvious satisfaction. Too much kindness, and they start getting uppity ideas about themselves. Too much cruelty, though, and they might do something truly foolish and desperate, like that awful business down in Georgia just last month. Noah's blood ran cold in his veins, but he forced his face to remain neutral and showed only polite, detached interest. "What business was that?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully casual. The merchant leaned closer across the table, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Slave murdered his own master, strung him up in the barn like a side of beef for slaughter. Man named Pierce owned a big cotton operation down there. They're still hunting for the killer, I hear, offering a hefty $1,000 reward for his capture." $1,000. The sum was staggering to contemplate, more money than most working people would ever see in their entire lifetimes. Noah realized with chilling clarity that virtually every white person he might encounter from now on was a potential bounty hunter, that his physical description was probably posted in every sheriff's office and newspaper, from Georgia to Ohio. "Terrible business indeed," Noah managed to say, his voice miraculously steady, despite the cold fear now racing through his body. "Indeed it is," the merchant agreed readily. "But it just shows what inevitably happens when you give slaves too much freedom and trust. That Pierce fellow was known for being too soft with his property, from what I've heard. Should have kept them properly, in line with a much firmer hand from the start." Noah excused himself from the table soon after, claiming honest fatigue from his long journey. In the privacy of his small, rented room, he carefully examined his reflection in the small mirror hanging above the simple wash basin. The man staring back at him looked fundamentally different from the field hand, who had fled the Pierce plantation just 3 weeks earlier. The constant, gnawing tension and the careful, deliberate acting required to maintain his disguise had subtly changed his very bearing, made him hold his body differently, with a new wariness. His hands, once merely softened by the repetitive tasks of barn work, were now rough and calloused from his arduous trek through the wilderness. But it was his eyes that showed the most profound change of all. They now held a hard, flinty quality that hadn't been there before, a deep weariness born from the exhausting knowledge that any single moment, any chance encounter, could bring sudden discovery and a swift, brutal death. He was no longer Noah Carter the slave, defined by his bondage, but he wasn't yet fully William Johnson the free man, secure in his liberty. He was something caught painfully in between, a fugitive suspended in the liminal space between two worlds, one of bondage and one of liberty. Elizabeth proved to be far more than just another station master on the railroad. Over the next 2 days, as Noah waited patiently for the next leg of his journey to be carefully arranged, she became something akin to a dedicated teacher, helping him refine and internalize his new persona as a free-colored man navigating a white-dominated world. She taught him practical social nuances, how to tip his hat politely to white strangers without appearing subservient or fearful, how to make casual conversation without accidentally revealing telling details about his fictional background, how to carry himself with the quiet, unassuming confidence of someone who owned his own labor and destiny. Freedom isn't just about the legal fact of not being owned by another person, she explained thoughtfully, as they walked together through the town's bustling market square, using the public space as a classroom. It's about knowing how to practically navigate the world as your own person, how to make your own decisions, and then live fully with the consequences, whatever they may be. Noah absorbed these crucial lessons eagerly, understanding that they were as vital to his long-term survival as the forged freedom papers carefully hidden in his pocket. The physical journey northward was only half the challenge he faced. The other, more subtle half, was the psychological journey of learning how to be free, how to think and act like someone who had never known the weight of chains or the constant threat of the whip. On his final night at the boarding house, Elizabeth thoughtfully introduced him to another guest, a well-spoken free black man named Frederick, who had successfully made the difficult journey from slavery to freedom years earlier, and now worked as a respected carpenter in Philadelphia. Frederick's personal story was both inspiring and sobering, a necessary reminder that freedom, while precious, brought its own unique set of challenges and dangers. "I won't lie to you," Frederick said frankly, as they sat together by the warm fire in Elizabeth's comfortable parlor. "Life up north isn't any kind of paradise for our people. There's plenty of prejudice and discrimination everywhere you turn. Jobs that slam the door in your face because of your skin color. Whole neighborhoods where you're simply not welcome. But for all that," he added, his voice firming with conviction, "it's still infinitely better than slavery, because at least you have choices, even when they're all hard ones." Frederick spoke knowledgeably about the vibrant, self-sufficient communities of free black people thriving in cities like Philadelphia and New York, places where former slaves had courageously built their own churches and schools, started small businesses, and raised families in relative safety. He also described the constant, draining vigilance required to avoid professional kidnappers who made their living by capturing and selling free black people back into the brutal Southern slave system, the critical need to carry and protect one's freedom papers at all times, and the necessity of staying perpetually alert for dangers that white people never had to consider in their daily lives. "But the best part, the part that makes it all worthwhile," Frederick said, his eyes lighting up with a father's pride, "is watching your children grow up knowing in their bones that they belong to themselves and no one else. My boy is 7 years old now, and when he asks me a question about the world, I don't have to worry and measure my words, afraid that my honest answer might plant dangerous ideas in his head. He's free to dream, as big as his imagination will take him, free to become whatever he's got, the God-given talent and personal will to be." The words struck Noah with the force of a physical blow, instantly reminding him of Marcus and the baby daughter he would likely never know. His entire sacrifice had been made in the desperate hope that someday they, too, might taste this same freedom. But he was now beginning to understand a terrible truth. His own hard-won escape might ultimately be meaningless if the people he loved most remained trapped in the very system he had fled. That painful realization planted a small but significant seed in Noah's mind, an idea that would grow steadily stronger and more compelling as he continued his journey north. Perhaps true freedom wasn't something to be selfishly enjoyed in isolation, but something to be shared, to be collectively fought for, to be actively extended to all the others still trapped within the brutal system he had narrowly escaped. The final tense leg of Noah's journey to the symbolic Ohio River took him through the dangerous border state of Kentucky, where the Underground Railroad operated under the constant, looming threat from professional slave catchers and greedy bounty hunters who patrolled the area. His conductor for this perilous stretch was a deeply principled Quaker farmer named Jeremiah, whose strong religious convictions had compelled him to open his simple home as a sanctuary for fugitive slaves. Despite the enormous legal and physical risks this hospitality involved for him and his family, Jeremiah was a quiet, contemplative man who seemed to find the presence of God in the everyday, honest work of farming and in the sacred duty of helping his fellow human beings in need. His house was filled with the warm, comforting bustle of a large family life, children laughing and playing freely, while their mother calmly tended to the endless tasks of running a busy household. For Noah, the scene provided a poignant, painful glimpse of what normal, secure family life could look like for free people, a powerful reminder of everything he was ultimately fighting and risking his life for. The Lord's teachings command us to help the stranger and the oppressed without hesitation, Jeremiah explained simply as he showed Noah to his temporary hiding place in the root cellar concealed beneath the main farmhouse. I cannot, in good conscience, claim to be a follower of Jesus if I willingly turn my back on folks seeking nothing more than their God-given freedom. The root cellar was cramped, dark, and earthy smelling, but it was also undeniably safe, expertly hidden beneath a cleverly constructed false floor that would fool all but the most determined and thorough search party. Noah spent 3 long days and nights hidden there, listening to the muffled, comforting sounds of family life unfolding above him, and thinking deeply about the series of desperate choices that had led him to this dark, underground refuge. During those quiet, introspective hours, he wrote another long letter to Sarah, this one filled with detailed descriptions of the many different people he had met and the unexpected kindnesses he had experienced along his way. He wanted her to know, needed her to understand, that the world was far bigger and more morally complex than either of them had ever been allowed to imagine, that there were good people of all colors who genuinely believed in justice and were courageously willing to act upon those beliefs, regardless of the personal cost. On his 4th tense night hiding at Jeremiah's farm, Noah was abruptly awakened from a fitful sleep by urgent, hushed whispers and the unmistakable sound of several horses approaching fast. Through the narrow cracks in the floorboards above his head, he could clearly hear men's voices, rough, demanding, and filled with authority, asking pointed questions about runaway slaves and threatening severe legal consequences for anyone caught harboring fugitives. "We know you Quakers help runaways," one voice declared harshly, dripping with contempt for their pacifist beliefs. "Got reliable reports of a particularly dangerous fugitive heading through these parts recently. Murdered his own master down in Georgia. Worth a clean $1,000 to the man who brings him in, dead or alive." Noah's heart hammered wildly against his ribs as he listened to the search unfold directly above him. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden floors, furniture was dragged aside and overturned. Voices grew alarmingly closer to his precise hiding place. His hand closed around the handle of his knife in the darkness, his mind resolved to fight to the death rather than be taken alive back to certain execution. But the clever false floor held its secret. and the frustrated searchers, finding no evidence of his presence, eventually moved on to terrorize other farms. When the coast was finally clear, Jeremiah helped a shaken Noah climb out of the dark cellar, the farmer's own face pale with the recent fright, but filled with a calm, unwavering determination. "Time to move you along to the next station," he said, quietly but firmly. "They'll be back for certain, and next time they might bring tracking dogs that can smell you out." The next morning, in the cold, gray light just before dawn, Noah began the final, critical stage of his journey to the Ohio River. His new conductor was a resourceful freed slave named Thomas, who had miraculously managed to buy his own freedom years earlier through sheer hard work, and now used his extensive knowledge of the river's secret crossings to help others make the life-altering transition from bondage to liberty. The Ohio River represented far more than just a geographical boundary on a map. It was the powerful, symbolic dividing line between the two Americas, one of slavery and one of freedom. It was the Jordan River of American bondage, a body of water that thousands upon thousands of desperate souls had risked everything to cross in their sacred search for the promised land of liberty. As Noah stood silently on its muddy southern bank, looking across the wide, dark, swirling water toward the twinkling lights of the free state of Ohio beyond, he felt the immense weight of history and the fierce pressure of hope pressing down on his shoulders. The river currents are particularly tricky and strong this time of year, Thomas warned practically as they prepared the small, weathered boat that would carry Noah across to freedom. But once you safely reach the other side, you'll officially be standing on free territory. You'll still have to be careful, mind you. There are slave catchers operating illegally up there too, ignoring the law. But at least the law itself will be on your side for once, instead of hunting you down. The actual crossing itself was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Just a few tense minutes of silent, hard pulling against the powerful current in a leaky, unstable boat. But when Noah's feet finally touched the solid ground of the Ohio shore, he felt something fundamental and permanent shift deep inside his soul. For the very first time in his entire life, he stood on soil where the institution of slavery was illegal, where his basic status as a human being was recognized and protected by law, if not always, by the prejudices of every individual he might meet. Thomas pointed him helpfully toward a known safe house in the bustling city of Cincinnati, where he could find rest, food, and guidance to plan his next moves in this new life. "From here on out, you're essentially on your own to make your way," Thomas said, clasping his hand in a firm farewell. "But remember this well. Freedom isn't a final destination you arrive at. It's a continuous way of living, a daily practice. Make the choices ahead of you count for something." As Noah walked away from the wide river, carrying nothing but his precious forged papers and the worn clothes on his back, he thought deeply about the long, harrowing journey that had finally brought him to this transformative moment. He had traveled hundreds of dangerous miles through hostile territory, relied completely on the courage and kindness of brave strangers, and risked his life countless times for the mere chance to stand where he stood now, breathing free air. But he also understood, with a new and sobering clarity, that his personal journey was far from over. True freedom brought with it new responsibilities, new challenges, and a lifetime of new choices about how to live meaningfully and what to fight for in the world. The story of Noah Carter, the enslaved man, was finally reaching its conclusion, but the story of William Johnson, the free man, was just beginning to be written. And that new story, he knew, would be shaped forever by how he chose to use the precious liberty he had claimed at such a great and terrible cost.